Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of 2023 hosted by the Global Environmental Law Centre and myself, Dr. Angela van der Bath, and the Global Environmental Law Centre researcher, Dr. Jesu Asukem. We are really excited to have Professor Karen Morrow here today, who is going to speak about gender and global climate governance. And for those of you that have participated in our webinars before or attended before, you will know that we've considered climate change from very broad perspectives. We've looked at energy transitions, we've looked at climate justice, we've looked at climate change in the context of agriculture and trade. And today we're looking at it from a very under-researched issue, at least, or a topic that is often overlooked, the gender aspect. So I'm really excited about today. Just a brief introduction. Professor Morrow was educated at Queen's University of Belfast at King's College London. She has lectured at Buckingham, Durham, Leeds Universities, and at the University of Belfast. She has been a professor of environmental laws at Swansea University since 2007. Her research interests focus on theoretical and practical aspects of public participation in environmental and sustainability law and policy, and on ecofeminism, gender, and the environment. Her current work focuses on ecofeminist approach to challenges of the Anthropocene, with a particular emphasis on climate change. She is also the series editor for Critical Reflections on Human Rights and the Environment with Edward Alger, and a member of the International Advisory Board for Cross-Disciplinary Gender and Environmental Cross-Disciplinary Gender and Environmental Series for Routledge. She also serves on editorial boards for the Journal of Environmental Rights and the Environmental Law Review at the University of Western Australia. She is also a member of Wales Net Zero 2035. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Morrow. I really am excited to hear what you have to speak about today, and I'm going to give over to you. I just want to ask that those of you in attendance today, if you have any questions, to keep them to the end, and you're also welcome to type your questions in the chat box. All right, thank you, Professor Morrow, over to you.
Thank you, Angela. First of all, thanks to everyone at the Centre for inviting me. It's lovely to join you and very, very nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to discussion with you later. I wish you a Prynhawn da, which is Welsh for good day, from South Wales, which is where I'm located in the UK. And that deals with any issues with time zones quite nicely. And let's get down to business. So I'm going to speak for between half an hour and 40 minutes. I'm just going to put the timer on my phone to make sure that that is what I actually do, because I could talk about this forever and that is not what you signed up to. And then I'm very, very happy to deal with questions. So, the ongoing saga of gender in global climate governance goes back to rather deeper roots. And I should say that law is the least photogenic of subjects. So you're now being treated to my collection of photographs on various sorts of feminist, ecological and anarchist street art by way of illustrating the slides and breaking up the text for a bit. So really, when we talk about gender as an issue that's relevant to climate change governance, we're seeing it as part of a broader recognition that social or societal factors are actually really relevant considerations in international environmental governance. And that realization was rooted in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, at least to a degree, where the international community took a very contrasting set of approaches to its integration of social or human factors in the environmental context. And probably the strongest contrast here is in the way that sustainable development was characterized, and in the way that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as agreed, was characterized. So sustainable development was the thing that grabbed most headlines probably in Rio, from Rio at the time. And I remember that because it was one of the things that motivated me to study environmental law in the first place. It was a long time ago. Sustainable development was, as I say, headline grabbing as the game changer in the way humanity was going to relate to the environment in future, bringing together and trying to come into balance on the social, the environmental, and the economic pillars that the WCED had identified in the Brundtland Report, which was research that was commissioned in the lead up to the summit itself. Now, that obviously didn't happen. We're still living in a world where environmental degradation increases. Things like species depletion, extinction risks are increasing. The game hasn't changed as far as that goes. But one thing that sustainable development did do was it really changed the orientation of international environmental law. So before the Earth Summit in environmental law circles, certainly, international environmental law was all about states. It was all about statecraft. It was all about high-level negotiations and essentially top-down approaches to agreeing things globally, making changes in domestic law thereafter. But sustainable development was a different sort of beast because, yes, it involved the top-down element. It certainly involved states. It involved international organizations, etc. But it also involved the need to incorporate bottom-up approaches, to involve stakeholders in the way that sustainable development was to progress in future. And one way that that was done was through the identification of a number of major groups representing various elements in society to bring those bottom-up perspectives into the frame going forward. And women were one of those groups. And that change was actually in many ways, or has in many ways, proved to be much more far-reaching than anything else that sustainable development has achieved, in my opinion. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change couldn't have been more different, and we'll come back to that shortly. But gender didn't just become a live issue in the field of sustainability and international environmental law by accident. It drew on past practice within the UN system. So right from the very first UN General Assembly meeting in London in 1946, so Eleanor Roosevelt, this is a bust of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the First Lady of the United States and a delegate to the UN, read an open letter to the assembled representatives of states. And in that open letter, she said, "We call on governments of the world to encourage women everywhere to take a more active part in national and international affairs. And we call on women who are conscious of their opportunities to come forward to do so." So from the beginning of the UN, that message fell on quite fertile ground. The UN in its fledgling form was very accommodating of that. And that same meeting in 1946 saw a subcommission on the status of women established under the Commission on Human Rights. That would eventually become the Commission on the Status of Women, or the CSW. So there was a background of a drive for participation of women in international governance right from the beginning. From that first meeting of the UN in 1946, there was a focus on improving women's participation based on the recognition that women were underrepresented in governance at all levels. And there was also, very significantly for the direction of travel under sustainability later and now under climate law, tried and tested active engagement with civil society in the activities of the Commission of the Status of Women. So from the beginning, women's groups across the world were able to feed into the CSW's work and play a very active role in that. So the CSW was quite unusual in that it was very bottom up in many ways from the beginning, in a way that really set the scene for exactly the sort of engagement that sustainable development later was going to look at more widely. And what grew up in the decades after the 1940s was a systematic, fairly systematic activism-based working method that strove to ensure women's inclusion in agenda setting, to ensure gender was included in decision-making processes, and to ensure that there was a realization that lived experience of women was as important a component of decision-making as technical or expert information. And in promoting those sorts of approaches, women's civil society movements worked on broader consensus building, networking and coalition building, sharing their skills and reaching out to other branches of civil society to augment their impact. So there was a really, really strong framing here, I suppose, that set the women's movement up very well for the advent of sustainability. And there were big problems to deal with. By the time we got to the Rio Earth Summit, there was a realization that there were real barriers to effective participation for women, that gender was an issue that raised social, economic, cultural, legal, and educational barriers that could stand in the way of effective participation. That led in turn to lack of representation. There were also issues with technical capacity to engage with international debate. There were issues around advocacy skills, and there were financial and procedural barriers that made it more difficult to participate. So there was activism, but there was also a recognition of problems. But that activism did feed into the Rio process. And there were two successes, two quite marked successes for the women's movement in staking a claim for gender issues in the sustainability context. The first of those was the inclusion of Principle 20 in the Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development. And Principle 20 tells us that women have a vital, not violent, that's a Freudian slip. Women have a vital role in environmental management and development, and their full participation is therefore necessary to achieve sustainable development. So the importance of Principle 20 is gender equality isn't an add-on here. It's integral to success in the substantive project of progressing sustainable development. More markedly, gender issues were very much brought to the fore in Agenda 21, which was the detailed blueprint for sustainable development. As I said in the introduction, women were included among the major groups in Agenda 21. But they also had a very strong impact in the shape of Agenda 21 itself, drawing on the experience they had with grassroots networking and feeding that into the international governance regime more generally. they actually, in the run-up to the Rio summit, found an area to focus on where they brought feminist analysis to bear in ways that really changed the shape of Agenda 21 itself. And in doing that, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, WEDO, which is a leading women's environmental NGO, set up a World Women's Congress for a Healthy Planet in 1991, the year before the Rio summit. And at that summit, the task was to look at the draft of Agenda 21, which was cast in traditional gender neutral terms. When we talk about gender neutrality, we mean that something that's supposedly suitable for, applicable to, or common to both male and female genders. So on the face of it, it looks very egalitarian, very equality-based. But unfortunately, gender neutrality can miss important inequalities. And what analysis of the draft of Agenda 21 told participants was that, yes, it was gender neutral, but it was also gender blind. And gender blindness is what the women's movement terms just disregarding gender as a significant factor in interactions between people. And the gender blind text of Agenda 21 missed a lot of the problems and barriers that women had with participating in governance at all levels. And so a text was redrafted that was gender literate. And the changes that were made there were actually adopted at Rio. So in the sustainability context, in Agenda 21, there was a real success at getting gender on the books and getting an understanding that gender was actually important to the process. However, as I said in my introductory slide, the UNFCCC couldn't have been more different. So there were some issues with the way that climate change was actually characterized in the initial approach to it at Rio. First of all, it was addressed very much in traditional international law terms. It was all about states, and it was characterized as being about technical issues, emissions, how to stop them, to a lesser degree, the economic ways that might be tackled, as well as technical solutions. But it wasn't really characterized as a people problem. It wasn't characterized as a sustainability issue. But the fact is that climate change is a people problem before it is anything else. Everyone in one way or another contributes to climate change to very different degrees. Everyone increasingly is affected by climate change to very different degrees. And it's not something that can ever be dealt with solely by top-down state-centric action. It's something that also needs a bottom-up element. So it is a sustainability issue. Now, it may be understandable that the UNFCCC took that approach because sustainability was just emerging at the same time. It was a co-outcome, if you like, of the Rio Earth Summit. But it was also partly because there was a misplaced enthusiasm for modeling the Framework Convention on Climate Change on the 1987 Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. Now, in many ways, that's understandable. That is one often trotted out as the most successful environmental agreement that we've ever had. But it was extremely different in legal terms from climate change. So it involved relatively few actors, emissions that were from industry that was on board with the changes, provided there was time to provide or develop alternatives. Climate change, of course, involves emissions from all sorts of sources, not just from industry. It involves everyone, everywhere, all at once. And I was quite cross with gender and climate change ally Antonio Guterres, who stole my line on that, which was my punchline for this talk about climate change. But he's right. Climate change does involve everybody, everyone, all at once. And it's not just a technical issue that you can fix with a single treaty. And actually, that came to be realized pretty quickly. Why is that important? And why do gender matters? Other matters too, youth, disability, indigeneity, class, all of these things are other examples of the types of social structural injustices or inequality that are present in climate change as they are in the societies, our societies that create it. So the reason that a technocratic approach was important was because it left out the people factors in gender issues that failed to acknowledge the fact that women were among the least implicated in causing climate change, but the most burdened by its adverse impacts, even at that early stage, and that's only increased. It failed to recognize the idea of intersectional and compound disadvantage. What does that mean? Intersectionality deals with the idea that no person is just one thing. So a woman may be young, or a person of color, or disabled, or an indigenous person, or all of these at once, disadvantaged in each of those contexts by social structures. And when you put them all together, you get an even more complex and more difficult picture of disadvantage from climate change. Women were and are underrepresented at institutional responses to climate change and at all levels, but women aren't just victims here. In not looking at a socially situated approach to climate change alongside technical issues, women and other underrepresented groups who are potentially powerful agents for change because they have real experience, on the ground experience, lived experience of adapting to climate change and of mitigating climate change, just weren't in the frame. So those issues, gender scholars could have told you at the time, were going to be relevant to climate change, and the intersection between climate change and gender was actually something that was recognized quite early on by a lot of other actors within the UN. So gender-focused bodies such as the Commission on the Status of Women and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, in around 2008 and 2009, both institutionally recognized that climate change was a gender issue and something that they would be concerned in. Development-focused bodies like the UN Development Programme, again around 2009, was really coming on board with the idea that climate change was a gender issue. They published a resource guide on gender and climate change at that point. And environment-focused bodies in the UN, such as the Convention on Biodiversity and the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, also in and around this time were recognizing that gender was a relevant issue to climate change. So outside the UNFCCC, this was a talking point very broadly across the UN. But it wasn't something that the UNFCCC itself was cognizant of. And so civil society started to put together a portfolio of arguments, if you like, for improving women's representation in the UNFCCC system. And some of the arguments that were raised were that they could bring additional perspectives to the table, not just from a social context, but also in scientific terms, that women bring a distinctive approach to engaging with risk. There'd been, by this point, lots of work done in psychology in particular, but also in politics, showing that not only do women treat risk distinctively from men in general, but also in environmental risk and in climate change contexts. And there was also broad work that had been done by feminists in the 70s and 80s, looking at building different approaches to decision making, so consensus building, and how that could play a role in coming to better conclusions. And above all, what women thought they could offer was an alternative to more of the same, which was what we initially had in the UNFCCC. So the UNFCCC itself had come quite early on to recognize that it did need to involve major groups, what they would term in this regime constituencies, for in their activities. And the UNFCCC's secretariat and regime machinery generally reached out to other major groups, so environmental NGOs, business and industry NGOs, local government and municipal authorities, Indigenous peoples, research and independent organizations, and trade unions NGOs, but not women. So women had been at a civil society level building a case for getting on board in the climate change regime. There was an early failed attempt at the first UNFCCC Conference of Parties in 1995. But it was only 2005, so 10 years later, 10 years in, that there was a parallel women's event at COP11 in Montreal that started to generate real momentum for representation for women among the constituencies in the UNFCCC. And there was some recognition within the official system in and around the early 2000s that women were absent, they were underrepresented, and that they needed to be present. The first inkling of that was Decision 36 CP7 from the 2007 COP in Bali. But it didn't really gain much traction, gain much influence. Probably the biggest thing that sparked real change was actually broader development in the UN, where the 1990 or 2002 Johannesburg Summit on Sustainable Development, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, brought gender to the fore more generally in the context of the Millennium Development Goals, in context of women's representation, etc. So there were changes within the broader UN in broadly environmental contexts that began to make the UNFCCC's failure to engage with gender issues look a bit peculiar, not just in terms of all of the wider organizations in the UN that we talked about, but when compared to its sister treaty, the Convention on Biodiversity, and even the Forest Principles, which had also come out of Rio, which were again more enlightened on gender representation than the UNFCCC. So it was really beginning to look like an outlier by this time. So the fundamental change, or catalyst for fundamental change, came from the women's movement's decision to apply officially for constituency status at COP14 in Poznan in 2008. Once they did that, they went about building a case for their constituencies. So they drafted a set of goals and objectives that involved a coalition of women's groups from across the world, both developed and developing world, because they recognized that women are not homogenous, they're not all the same, and that there were lots of perspectives involved. So there was lots of consultation, lots of dialogue, and the case was built around the Gender CC Charter. Gender CC is what the gender constituencies known as. It was provisionally recognized in 2009 and formally recognized in time for the Durban COP in 2011. 15 years. So 15 years into the operation of the UNFCCC, we finally get gender recognized as a major group who have a relevant contribution to be made in the context of climate change. That's staggering, and it should appall you it should offend you, and it should surprise you. But things have changed within the UNFCCC pretty quickly since then. So they took a very long time to come on board with recognizing gender, but once they did, they acted quite quickly, and they now run regular gender workshops for states. And there's now a gender day, or has been since 2013, at each conference. More importantly, though, because those are quite media friendly, but not necessarily very substantive changes, since 2013, the UNFCCC has adopted a process of gender composition reporting, and that covers state delegations to the process and the regime's own bodies. So that has made the lack of equality in gender contexts extremely visible. Other big changes, I suppose, came about from the Lima work programme on gender, which was instituted in 2014 and which has since been continued with the enhanced Lima work programme on gender and a very specific, very goal-oriented gender action plan. And I don't have time to talk about them in detail here, but I'm happy to take questions about them. But what they do, from a very brief point of view, is they make sure that gender is on the agenda, it is visible, and it is a standing item now for the UNFCCC. So it's a huge change. But it's a huge change that hasn't necessarily, it's important in principle, it hasn't necessarily done as much as you might expect in practice. And I wanted to use gender and COP26 as a case in point, because I can comfortably point the finger at my own government here in the UK. COP26 was in Glasgow, and it was hosted by the UK government. And I can show how a country that thinks that it has done great things on gender equality can really produce massive fails in this area. So let's start with the unedifying saga of the UK leadership team for COP26. A year before COP26, the UK announced its top negotiating team for the conference. There was not a single woman on it, not one. This was despite the fact that the UN, or that the Paris Agreement, had pointed to the role of women. The UK had agreed with that. It signed up to all of the changes that the UNFCCC itself had brought in gender, and then completely ignored it when setting up its own team. This caused, as you would imagine, huge outrage in civil society, and a group was set up called She Changes Climate in December 2020 to tackle this, and it adopted an ongoing campaign, it's still in place now, called #5050vision, which is looking for 50% representation of diverse women in states' top level climate delegations. And this really exposed how bad the UK's practice was. So they published an open letter pointing out that the UK's approach failed in terms of the UNFCCC's regime priorities. It failed on practical areas because women's inclusion was necessary for effective climate decision making and outcomes, and it made the UK's leadership incredible, unbelievable, unconvincing. And that gained huge support, and it also got them access to government. And the government did, on the face of things, cave. In the end, it increased the representation of women on the top team to 16 out of 35 in the final cohort. On closer scrutiny, though, that was actually quite a limited change, because while more women were added to the core team, they were mostly at lower levels and in either deputy roles or supporting or advisory roles. They didn't have much of a place in the actual negotiations or at senior levels. At these, men still outnumbered women 5 to 1. So that's a very stark example. In terms of things that are more routine, the snapshots of reporting on gender delegations continue to show that women, for the most part, are underrepresented. Even in the UN's own body, or FCC's own bodies, where they have at least more ability to encourage states to ensure that women are represented. In 2020, of its 16 sub-bodies, 3 had female representation of 50% or above. 3 had 40% or above, 6 had 30% or above, 4 had 20% or less. And in terms of leadership, while there've been some improvement with the UNFCCC's commitments in this area and with its reporting, it was fairly stagnant by 2020. That's revealing in itself. Some progress, not enough, like we hear on climate change itself all the time. There was also something innovative that was done in 2021 in the UNFCCC, where they actually took advantage of the shift of preparatory meetings online because of COVID, and they actually carried out a speaking time study of the plenary meetings of some of the UNFCCC's constituent bodies. Starting point on that, they found men formed 51% of state delegations. So in prep meetings, particularly online prep meetings, women were more present than they were necessarily in some of the in-person meetings. But they accounted for 60% of those who spoke and 63% of the speaking time. Some of the bodies were headed by women. So they would be speaking to do the housekeeping, to ask people to speak, etc., talk about the rules of engagement, timekeeping, those sorts of things. Once you took those out of the equation, men accounted for 74% of the speaking time. So women were present, but they weren't doing the talking. And even if they were doing the talking, what they were talking about wasn't necessarily anything that would affect the substance of what was being said. Quantitative, limited because of that, but revealing nonetheless. So quantitative analysis can tell us a great deal. It won't tell us everything, and it will give an incomplete picture. The incomplete picture is uninspiring enough, I think, as far as that goes. Qualitative analysis is needed too, though. We need to know exactly, we need content analysis of what was being said and how that mapped on to agreed outcomes from the preparatory meetings. But quantitative analysis does at least alert us to the fact that there's an issue that needs to be resolved. So what does this tell us? Well, the UNFCCC has now bought in to gender balance in its internal bodies, but it can only do so much in pushing that forward. States, of course, remain the prime movers in international law, environmental and otherwise, and they choose their delegates for their own national delegations. They choose who they're going to put forward to be on the UNFCCC's constituent bodies. And most states don't appear to have any shame about failing to live up to the commitments that they've already made in international law to deliver on gender equality in this context. Normally, if a state is failing to live up to its commitments, we use embarrassment, social, political embarrassment, as a lever to actually push them to do what they've said they will do. But that doesn't work when most states are failing, because no one feels comfortable in pointing the finger, I suppose. And the UNFCCC isn't alone in this area in gender issues. You can see it everywhere in climate governance. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has just been in the news this week, is a good idea or a good example of this. So it is the independent body that reviews and assesses and reports on science, technology, and socio-economic research on climate change to inform global climate governance and the work of the UNFCCC. It is a body that is very unequal in a lot of ways. So the developing world is underrepresented in its membership and its outputs. And gender inequality is a pervasive problem and has been for as long as the body has existed, but it was only officially recognized as an issue in 2018. Again, I think that's quite astounding. We've had the notion of equal rights for women for 3/4 of a century now, and yet very smart people are suddenly recognizing it's a problem. Not quite getting the idea if it's a structural problem, it's everywhere, and we should be looking out for it, not having to discover it in every new context. So it was acknowledged as a problem in 2018, and to be fair, it was the subject of a fairly radical and active engagement by the UNFCCC, or the IPCC's governance team at this point. So they set up a gender action team immediately and committed to a gender action plan in 2019. And by 2020, they were implementing this. However, the IPCC even is just like the UNFCCC, state populated. The biases and closures of unequal societies feed through into our scientific bodies just as much as they do to our global governance context. It's not excusable. It's not even really explicable. We know that our societies are not gender equal. We know that science is male-dominated, STEM subjects are male-dominated. And we know that the IPCC operates in the broader UN system. So alongside the UNFCCC, which now has been for the best part of a decade prioritizing gender equality, but it's also sponsored by the UN Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organizations, both of which are bodies that have long adopted the UN's broader gender equality priorities. So it's inexplicable, I think, that it took this long. So big hand clap that something is finally happening. And it has at least, I suppose, adopted a fairly cutting edge approach. So the gender action and implementation plans adopt an intersectional understanding of gender inequality. They adopt a commitment to gender mainstreaming, making sure that the work looks at both genders and no genders, and also questions of gender balance. But it's stunning, I think, that a body that's so advanced on some levels is so clueless, I suppose, on others. So why does any of this matter? Well, the current UN Secretary General is an ally in gender equality and an activist on climate action, and has been consistently throughout his tenure. And he said just this week, talking about the IPCC as, apologies for the error there, synthesis report, that it's a clarion call to massively fast-track climate efforts in every country, every sector, and on every time frame. Our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once. But he left out something, I think, and everyone, all at once. Climate change, above all, is a people problem, and people are where we're going to ultimately find solutions. Technicians, scientists, economists, but also grassroots organizations, ordinary people. So my time is up, just about right. It's actually quite interesting, and I'll leave you with this thought. Gender equality in climate governance raises the sorts of issues around lack of political will that we see in climate change processes globally more generally. The recurring refrain is that more needs to be done, and more swiftly. We can't keep saying that. We've actually got to start doing it. And there I shall end and stop my screen share.
Thank you so much, Professor Morrow, for that very thought-provoking and detailed presentation. It is so interesting for me to see how women or gender issues more broadly, but also the issue of women and climate change has developed over time. At one point, we want to say, wow, we've progressed, but in other aspects, it doesn't feel like we have. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to open the floor to questions. If anyone is interested in asking Professor Morrow a question, you're welcome to raise your hand or to type a question in the Q&A or chat.
Turned off my alarm.
Is there anyone that wants to start or ask a question? If there isn't anyone immediately, then I will take.
I have one.
Oh, who is speaking now?
Is Jessie.
Oh, all right. Jessie, you start the question then. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for this wonderful presentation on the development of gender aspect in the context of climate change, and how this development could help address the climate change. But I have a particular worry about the patriarchal tendency of climate change negotiation, especially with the example of the UK Saga and the overflow of male in the UNFCCC itself. So my worry is, how does this fine gender mainstreaming in the law could really be translated into practice to enhance that, to effectively address the issue of climate change that is affecting everyone.
Okay, right. Very good question, JC, I have to say. And the gender action plan certainly drills down into the practicalities of this. But it's actually quite interesting how the first hurdle was representation. Getting women in the room is a start. Now that in its own isn't going to necessarily deliver anything better, because it's not enough to be in the room. You've got to be heard in the room. You've got to be influential in the room, and that's much more difficult. But if you're not in the room, that doesn't happen. So the UNFCCC's obsession with numbers in the first instance is quite significant, but it's not their whole solution. And actually building with civil society, they're also looking at ways of making sure that women's participation is more effective where women are in the room. Part of that, they work alongside the Mary Robinson Climate Justice Foundation, which is an NGO that looks at networking, mentoring, skills and capacity building for women in climate governance contexts. And that's really important. There are a couple of other things that are quite interesting as well in terms of that. You know, COVID did show us that online participation opens the door for more women to take part, because everywhere in the world, pretty much women, whether they're in professional roles or not, tend to be primarily responsible for childcare. So for a lot of women, actually attending international conferences becomes difficult, and you tend to get older or child-free women, but not others. So there's an inequality in there. So actually maybe using online participation more judiciously would be a way of actually ensuring greater representation in terms of numbers. But as we've seen, that doesn't necessarily change what's happening in terms of who's talking and what influence it's having. I would dearly love to actually do a content analysis study to see the gender of contributors and how it feeds through into conclusions from groups, and then feeds through into the broader UNFCCC processes. I think that's absolutely necessary. But I think there are other practical things that can improve things even with that in mind, including training chairs of the UNFCCC's constituent bodies to actually recognize their own unconscious biases, and to make sure that they think carefully about who they invite to speak, the timing of contributions, who's contributing, etc. So there are a couple of ways that we can do it. We can train women as participants so that they are equipped and confident to contribute. We can also enable them to participate, perhaps by looking at childcare provision at big international conferences, or using online participation more effectively. But we also need to train actors within the system itself to recognise that gender inequality is a structural issue. It's built into everything that we do, and it doesn't disappear by saying the right things. It's doing the right things that's actually necessary to achieve that. Does that help?
Yes, it does. It does. I was also having an issue of the practical application of this gender equality aspect at the local level, because in there you raise the lack of political will as an issue against gender equality. Do you think states at the domestic level will be willing to actually follow this gender aspect, and to what extent is it possible?
I think some states are more willing than others, and actually my next piece of work in this, I'm going to be looking at nationally determined contributions with examples from the developing world versus examples from the developed world. We actually find the developing world sometimes is a lot more innovative and activist on gender equality than the developed world. The developed world tends to be quite complacent and thinks that gender equality is a box that they've ticked, a job they've done. They haven't. Nowhere is going to achieve gender equality anywhere within 300 years, according to the latest statistical snapshot from the UN Statistics Service on the SDGs, which is pretty horrific, isn't it? 300 years. So nobody can be smug about this. So I think it's actually publicizing that is important, because generating political will, generating shame that you're leaving more than half your population behind has to be important. But there are actually also very practical arguments that I think we can leverage here. I mean, you know, there's now been so much research done that shows that diverse decision-making leads to better outcomes because it leads to better information. I'll give you a brilliant example actually from my own university, where I was invited to a really interesting cross-disciplinary meeting with some engineers about climate change. And they had this wonderful project to develop a hydrogen stove as clean cooking technology for a developing country destination. And it's great if you want to cook quick and clean. But I looked at it and thought, have you actually asked the women who are doing the cooking what they want to cook? Because if you're cooking a fried egg, fast and clean is brilliant. If you're cooking goat stew, a hydrogen stove's not going to do it well, because you need it to cook really slowly and for a very long period of time. You need to be able to leave it well, the women were already doing it in wood-fired ovens while you get on with other things. And asking that question is crucial to knowing whether you're going to deliver a practical solution that's actually going to help or be irrelevant. People would be very happy to say, oh yeah, give me the stove. They probably won't use it if it doesn't do what it needs to do. So actually, you know, at that very basic level, if you want a successful outcome on your climate change goal, you actually need to have an informed, gender literate decision-making process. And that's true on a lot of other things. It's a very minor example, but I've seen it in so many contexts.
All right, thank you.
You didn't think I'd be talking about goat stew?
No.
Thank you so much for that discussion. I was wondering, I have two questions.
Yeah, sure.
So the first one is whether you could, for the audience, just draw some parallels that you see of the challenges that women may face, perhaps that are similar to the obstacles that other marginalized or at-risk or vulnerable groups could face in the climate debate.
Yeah.
And then something else I was wondering, to what extent are the implementation plans really thinking about very niche or unique challenges that women face when it comes to climate change in different cultures. I'm also thinking about the rights. There's a lot going on now in debates regarding climate change and Indigenous communities and those rights. And to what extent is gender and women really also featuring in that debate?
Okay, right. So first question, parallels. The challenges that women face are very similar in lots of ways to other underrepresented groups. So one of them is the resources to participate, the time, being able to get to meetings, having good enough internet to be able to take part in online events, etc. Being able to make space in a schedule and get freedom from your other responsibilities, be those professional or personal. That's a problem for anybody. Another issue that those who can participate come up with in these underrepresented groups is participation fatigue. International bodies and domestic governments tend to go back to the same people over and over and over again. And you might have quite a small civil society group, for example, that's not very well resourced, that has limited personnel, that's being given lots of opportunities to participate, but can't meaningfully undertake them without proper support. So resources are probably an issue for everybody. Capacity to put your views across. I was at a virtual CSW event last week where Indigenous women were talking about climate change, and they were extraordinarily eloquent. They knew and understood the issues that they were facing better than anyone else. And getting into a room with them is the way that you change views among decision makers, I think. But you have to listen, and you have to recognize that no one can speak more credibly about women's experience or Indigenous experience or young people's experience or disabled people's experience, you name it, than the people who are actually living it. And if climate change affects everybody, it's also true to say that everybody lives with it, but that means everybody has a perspective and everyone has something to offer. So you've got to recognize that that alone gives credibility, and that it's not a replacement for scientific or economic or psychological or sociological expertise, but it's a necessary ingredient in the mix to coming up with effective climate responses. In terms of action plans and recognizing niche problems, certainly I can speak to the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan, which I know most about, and there have actually been specific streams on Indigenous women, on women from developing countries and their particular needs, in a recognition that women are not all the same. Of course, we're not, and there are particular areas where capacity building has to be prioritized to make sure that we have a broad spectrum of women at the table, that we're not reproducing the closures of a developed world dominated system, because that doesn't work. Climate change isn't a problem for the developed world or the developing world, it's a problem for the whole world. And it's imperative that the whole world is actually actively represented and involved in the changes that we need to make to deal with it.
Thank you so much for that. All right, is there anyone else in the audience that maybe wants to take an opportunity to ask Professor Morrow a question?
Don't be shy.
I see some of my students here, maybe they would be interested.
Maybe I could ask you a question, just for a show of hands, so using the reactions tab. How many of you thought gender was actually a significant climate issue before you saw the title of this talk? So if you thought it was significant, give me a hands up or a thumbs up. If you hadn't thought about it at all, give me one of those. I'm one of those people who thought it was significant because I realized it's a structural issue, but not everybody necessarily thinks of it in those terms. So can we see? Got any thumbs or scared faces, if you have the ability to use them on your setup?
I did briefly see 2 thumbs.
Yeah, good. Well, hopefully, now we have thumbs all over the place going out.
Great.
So it's a really interesting issue, but it's not just a women's issue, it's an everybody issue. And it's an everybody issue because we need male allies in the male-dominated system to make change. But also, you know, the women's movement in international law has never just been about women's concerns. It's all about reaching out to other groups where there are women members, where there are shared concerns. And there's a lot of learning to be done in that.
Indeed. Thank you, Professor Morrow. Before we close, I was wondering if you wanted to take the opportunity just to tell us if there's anything interesting you're working on right now or in the future for the people who are going to watch this recording when we upload it, just to keep an eye on.
Okay, well, I've just had an article come out in Transnational Legal Theory, which talks about COP26. So you'll find out more there about the UK's huge fail with its leadership team, but also much more detail on progress and the lack of it in representation on the UNFCCC's bodies and on the speaker survey. The speaker survey, I think, is particularly interesting for anybody who's interested in underrepresented groups, because it really shows how getting into the room isn't enough. And it's the next thing to work on. And one of the next things I'm working on is a big transdisciplinary gender book project on the ongoing coverage of gender in climate change. I'm looking at the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, to see where gender is present, where it's not. And I'm also going to look at the UNFCCC's gender. They now have a gender page, which makes life a lot easier, but to see which countries are leading and innovating, because they're not the countries people will think of. And I'd like to draw more attention to good practice globally on that, and maybe shame the developed world out of being quite so complacent about it. Job is not done.
Yes, thank you. That is very interesting. I think I completely agree with you. We might be surprised about which countries do feature gender in their NDCs. That you've given me an interesting assignment to give to my students now, seeing as though we are looking at South Africa's NDC tonight in our class.
Well, maybe seek to identify what's there and how it could be improved.
Exactly. Right,
I'd love to be a fly on the wall in that class. That'd be really interesting.
All right. Oh, thank you. I see there's just a comment thanking you also in the chat. Professor Morrow, thank you for making the time to speak to us today. Your work really is very valuable. I'm so glad that we have people like you championing this very topical issue and challenge of women all over the world. I look forward to speaking to you again and inviting you back. And please keep in touch.
It would be my pleasure. The centre does fantastic work. There's nothing in your programs that doesn't interest me. It all sounds fantastic. Excellent. Very cutting edge.
Thank you. We are going to release this recording on our YouTube channel. Also on the university's YouTube channel, the videos get quite a lot of engagement afterwards as well.
Okay, that's really good. Okay, well, thank you for coming, everybody. It's been a great pleasure and hopefully thought-provoking for you.
Definitely.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.